Hi, I'm Andrea McLeod. I'm the lead researcher and the head of the Multilingual Families Lab at the University of Alberta. In discussions with the EPL team, we've really been talking a lot about the importance of supporting multilingual families in the community here. And through those discussions, I've been invited to develop a workshop to support the work of those of you that are working with these families with young children. So this will be the first part of the workshop where we'll be talking about the basics of multilingualism. Before we go much further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Misquachi, Waskahegan, which is also known as Edmonton. As many of you know, it's Cree for Beaver Hill House, and this part of what is now Alberta has been historically and continues to be a gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples. And as we know, if you spend any time outside of the city, there's definitely we know that this is a very important place for the beavers for being able to gather. There's wonderful lands, there's wonderful water in the area, and so just a great place to be able to come together. And I feel really honored to be able to work and live here, especially as a person of settler descent and somebody who's also new to this part of Canada, having moved to the area in 2019. So when we think about multilingualism or learning a language, it's important to remember that learning a language is more than learning grammar and sounds. It's also about learning culture. So our connection between our language and our culture is a vital connection, and that's part of why sustaining multilingualism is so important, to be able to maintain not only the knowledge of the language, but also that connection um, an embodiment of one's culture. So today's workshop will step us through three main components. So talking about what is multilingualism, why is it important, and talking about marginalized languages, exposure, and registries. So what is multilingualism? Well, multilingualism is the ability to communicate in more than one language, quite simply. So multilingual individuals may differ in their ability to speak each language, their ability to communicate across settings. So a multilingual person may be more comfortable in one language at home, but another language at work, or school, or in the community. So there is that. Not only do we have two languages or more than two languages, but we have different strengths across those languages. Their relative levels of proficiency or correctness in each language may vary. And then it's not just two languages in one brain. So multilinguals have cognitive control when they use or don't use each language. So that ability to access a language and another really is part of our cognitive control or executive functioning, if you may have been familiar with that term. And multilingual language abilities also develop and change over time. So we know that children may show different levels of proficiency and cognitive control as they acquire their languages. So as they're learning their languages, these will change over time. There's a lot of different factors that can influence their multilingualism, and these may be the age of first exposure to each language, the amount of exposure to each language, and the sociolinguistic context, which really refers to how each language is valued and thus what are the opportunities to use the language in the community. So we know that learning a language takes place in different contexts. So it takes place at home, in the community, and at school. For our young children in particular. So when we think about language use at home, it really leads to that sense of attachment to a language. So that sense of connection to the language and a connection to one's family. When we think about learning the language in the community or using the language in the community, So when we use it in a community, we're also creating those opportunities for learning. That creates this sense of belonging to the language. So that sense of belonging to a broader community that have that shared language and different opportunities that come through that. And then when we think about learning the language in school, this really leads to academic knowledge of the language. So having more formal knowledge, perhaps the breadth of vocabulary may be different because we're learning the language to talk about not just the here and now, but the past, the future. We're using the language also to talk about concepts that may not be tangible in everyday life. So we may be using it to talk about um, mathematical concepts, about historical frames of reference, etc. So we really are learning different parts of the language when we're learning it in school. So for children who speak one language, the language is used in all these contexts. So they really have language learning at home, in the community, and at school that are working together to expand the breadth of knowledge that they have and also reinforce. So we have that one language being used across all contexts. But when we think about children who are learning more than one language, the languages are used in different contexts. There's sometimes overlap and there's sometimes less overlap. So they may be using one language at home and then using another language in the community and at school. So for example, they may be using Punjabi at home, but English in the community and at school. Some other children may experience different distributions, so they may be able to use Arabic at home, Arabic in some community settings, and then using English mainly at school. And for some, so we really see that difference in where one is learning one's language, which also means that you may have a better handle on certain vocabulary, certain concepts that are more related to the home context. And then in your other language, you have a better handle on certain concepts and vocabulary that are related to the language used at school. And there may be less overlap between those knowledges, especially as you're building those bridges. So when we think about language learning, knowing that it varies, knowing that there's different contexts, one of the big things that comes up too is, why is multilingualism important? So multilingualism is a benefit. It has social and cultural advantages. So it keeps cultural identity, can help support access to one's faith, and provide those links with family and community. There's also language advantages. So among multilingual speakers, there's research that have shown that they have earlier metalinguistic abilities. So that ability to kind of step back and realize that, oh, there's different words for the same object. Or um, uh, how interesting, in one language, my adjective comes before the noun, and in the other language, it comes after. So having that ability to understand that languages are organized differently. And they also know how to change language based on context. So that really taps into the ability to be attuned to the listeners in their context of who else is here and being able to make those adjustments, which is another form of pragmatic language use. There's research that have shown some educational advantages. So a strong home language helps to learn the language of school. And it can also provide opportunities for studying different literatures, for studying in different contexts when one becomes older. So it can open those doors as well in terms of education. And there can be professional advantages. So in a global context, knowing more than one language can open doors. Open doors in terms of job options. It can also open doors in terms of where one is planning to live or travel. So a few other things about multilingualism. So there are some misunderstandings or misperceptions or myths in general about multilingualism and bilingualism if we think of the specific just two languages in our community. So we know, however, that learning more than one language doesn't cause delays or difficulties with language learning. That a child that is having difficulties learning language will have those difficulties regardless of which languages they're learning, and will also have difficulties regardless of how many languages they're learning. So by shedding a language or letting go of a language, we're not going to accelerate their language learning. We're not going to diminish those difficulties. We also know that being multilingual doesn't cause confusion in identity. And in fact, being bilingual can help develop stronger sense of identity. A person can better understand how they're situated within their social context. We also know that being multilingual is not an exception or unusual. When we think of it from a global perspective, we know that around the world, most people are multilingual. So in this next set of slides, we're going to talk about marginalization, specifically when it comes to language, the role of exposure, and thinking about different registers. So when one language is a marginalized language, it can change the use of each language and influence the development of the languages. So when we think about multilingualism or bilingualism in an abstract way, sometimes we do it in a way that's detached from the sociolinguistic context. So we think of the two languages that have a neutral or equal standing, and how does one learn those two languages? But in actual in reality, those languages are situated in a social context. There's different factors that are at play. There's colonialism, there's anti-Indigenous perspectives that have led to not just marginalization, but to language death. There's racism and discrimination at play. And those occur both within our Canadian context, but can also occur on a global scale. So all of these influence the language learning opportunities, but also how that each language can evolve over time. So one language that and in my figure here, I'm just pointing out at the fact that that may also lead to ebbs and flows of the language. So when one language is a marginalized language, that can influence the amount of time that a child hears the language, and that influences in turn their abilities in the language. We know that children who are exposed to a language at least 20% of their time will likely use that language spontaneously. We also know that if they're exposed to the language 40% of the time, that their vocabulary can develop in a way that's comparable to a monolingual speaker of that language. As we work with parents, one thing that we learn is that when children are attending preschool or school full-time, that time in school or that time in preschool is equivalent to 40 to 50% of their week. So when we think of exposure, for example, to the mainstream language, which is most often English, that means that in a child's week, they already have this chunk of time that is dedicated to that mainstream language, and that's usually around 50%. So that leaves really a smaller amount of time that's either equivalent or smaller amount of time for that marginalized language. And figuring out how to continue to support that marginalized language is a task that often falls on the shoulder of parents, whereas that mainstream language has a really broad range of supports that are available in the community, at school, that really enforce the strength of that mainstream language. So part of the work we've been doing through the Multilingual Language Program is figuring out how to share that support for that marginalized and minoritized language with parents. How can we create spaces outside of the home in the community where that language is valued, where that language is supported, so that not only parents but children can also feel that sense of pride and value in their language. We also know that when one language is a marginalized language, that learning the exceptions to the language or a more uncommon grammar may take more time. And that may be because there's fewer number of people that are speaking the language around them, but also that they have somewhat lower exposure to the language. So this can lead to some errors that persist longer than we would see in a child who's learning just one language at a time. So these are some examples from my own children who speak French. We speak French at home and they attend a French language school, but I still see them producing errors that persist longer than I would have seen when I've worked with children in a French language context in Quebec. So, for example, overgeneralizing the rule around plural. So, j'ai vu trois chevals instead of trois chevaux. Um, the changing the verb family. So, c'est ça que vous disiez instead of c'est ça que vous dites. And some gender errors. So, for example, ma manteau instead of mon manteau. So, these are things where children definitely have strong expressive competencies. They're making their message known. It's not confusing what they're saying, but they are making these smaller errors, and these persist somewhat longer. So for some families, they may feel, children may feel like their parents are correcting them a lot, which sometimes leads to feeling like not very confident about the language. So that's some feedback sometimes we provide to parents is not to overcorrect, to really provide the model and then move forward with it. So because we know that this is normal and that children will learn these structures eventually, but that we'll see sometimes that it takes them somewhat more time. When a language is marginalized, we might also see that children mix their languages or use words from one language in the other. So a child might say, when playing with a truck, I saw a truck go vit, vit, vit. So I saw a truck go fast, fast, fast. Again, this is normal, and many multilingual communities also among adults switch between languages. We do that particularly when we know that their listener also understands our other language, and we do it for all kinds of reasons, sometimes because the word doesn't exist in our other language or is less well known. Sometimes we do it for style, and sometimes we do it for convenience, just because we're just struggling to find the right word in one of our languages. We know the person will understand it, so we switch. So for children, learning how to use their languages together is also part of their multilingual competencies. So as we step through with parents, we'll sometimes talk about the importance of, well, we often talk about the importance of exposure and thinking about who speaks which language. So parents might use different strategies at home. Some families may use one parent, one language. And that may be very authentic because each parent has a different language, different language knowledge. We also see some families where they use only the home language at home. And we also see some families that combine both the home language and English. What we know from our research is all of these strategies work. So for families, our advice is really do what's authentic to you, but think about choosing a strategy that fits your language, but also allows you to get sufficient exposure to the other language to help that language grow. So rather than thinking about who's speaking what language as the main strategy, what we talk about is making sure that we make enough time for the marginalized language. So we suggest that parents develop a plan that works for them and their expectations. So for example, if we think about wanting to reach that 20% of time where the minority or minoritized or marginalized language is used, that means about 16 hours a week. So if a child is in daycare full time, and that's an English environment, that takes up about 50% of the time. So one strategy could be that a family uses their home language on Saturdays and Friday evening, for example. So that would lead us up to the 20%. And being really mindful that those days we're really dedicating to our minoritized language. In families where one of the parents isn't so comfortable with the other language, we can use a different strategy. So the strategy may be to just ensure that the other language, the home language, is being used regularly and that the child is encouraged to respond in that language. Another example, if our goal is to have 50% of our time where the marginalized language is used, that would come out to about 40 hours a week. So if the child's in daycare in English full time, then that would mean speaking the home language on weekends and evenings to ensure that 50%. So we really see how our goals as a family will shape how we're using the languages at home. Another component to consider is registers, and this is a word that means different things depending on different contexts, right? So when we're thinking about language and sociolinguistic contexts, registers refers to the different ways we use language based on context. So this is a way of talking about a more formal register, for example, that we might use in an interview, and then all the way down to a more informal register when we're talking with a friend. So for children, more formal registers are often used in class for learning, and then they use more informal registers with friends. This can mean, again, not only is it the vocabulary that's different based on the context of language learning, but also the pragmatics, sometimes the grammar, and style may be different in the language use across these contexts. We can also distinguish between written and oral registers. So some languages are rarely used in their written form. Some languages don't have written forms. And in these contexts, storytelling instead of book reading can be a way to sustain that language, but also to expand the registers that are used. And some languages have very different forms based on their register. So the way the language is used in its written form is quite different than the way we speak it day to day. So one of those examples is Arabic, where standard Arabic is often used in written form, even for children's books. But families may speak a dialectal version of Arabic. So they may speak Moroccan Arabic or Algerian or Syrian Arabic. And their alignment may differ. And I've heard from some families say that, well, the language, the Arabic used in the book is almost a new language for our child. So they may not recognize the words, they may not recognize the sentences structures because it's quite different than the dialect we use. So that mismatch can be quite challenging challenging and in the contrast with English, where there's more alignment between our spoken register and our written register. And so we can support children's language learning through reading. In other languages, there's less alignment, so that can create an additional burden to support the language learning. So although books continue to be important, sometimes thinking beyond books in terms of thinking, well, what can we do through storytelling? How can we adapt the book for our context are all things to consider. So some challenges we've heard from parents and that we see is that that come through is that not all children in multilingual homes become multilingual themselves. And these challenges can come from different sources. So parents may feel a social pressure to not to speak their own language with their child. This can come in very explicit ways. So they may experience racial or discriminatory, they may have racist or discriminatory experiences tied to themselves, but also linked to their language in the Canadian context. It may also be more implicit when you see all of the supports that focus on English in the community, that focus on the importance of learning English for the adults, but also for children. It can help them feel that it can reinforce the idea or reinforce the idea that their home language isn't valuable. They may believe that to learn English, their children needs to only speak English. And that again may be something that they've been explicitly told. So to help their child achieve in school, they should be focusing on English. And again, we know that you can support the home language, and that support and having strong home language can help with the learning in school. They may also believe that speaking only English is a better path to success, and that might have they may have experienced how that knowing English has opened doors when in the Canadian context. They may have also experienced discrimination because of their accent or language knowledge, and see that they don't want their own children to experience that. And then parents may be told to only speak English at home by professionals such as doctors, teachers, and nurses. This may be because they had concerns about their child's development, and sometimes it's just a general advice that they hear. So these are different challenges that are all really important to consider, but also one of the ways that I think about it is providing supports for the home language is like keeping the door open and welcoming people in. And they may not come in right away, but over time they see that that door is still open, that there's still the welcoming of the home language outside of the home really speaks to that value and creating community around it. So in the second part of the training, we'll focus on some strategies to support parents in transmitting their home language in more depth. So I really appreciate your time. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person and working on kind of more in-practice strategies and talking about the multilingual language program in depth. So thanks a lot, and look forward to our connecting with you soon. Bye.